A lot of marketers are familiar with A B testing, usually with regards to website testing and conversion rate optimization. There are a lot of tools like Optimizely and VWO and the soon to be dead Google Optimize that makes those kinds of tests really easy to implement. But there's another kind of testing that marketers are becoming more interested in lately, and that's testing of the marketing itself. It goes by many names: randomized controlled trials, geo-lift experiments, holdout testing. Maybe you've heard of some of these, but you weren't sure where to start with how to implement them. And there's certainly not a robust industry of software companies making this easily accessible. So, what's a marketer to do? Well, today I'm thrilled to be joined by someone who can help us understand this testing landscape a little better. Someone who has both an academic and a business side background. She has a bachelor's in mathematics, a master of science in industrial engineering, and a PhD in marketing. She's applied those learnings at companies like General Motors and Amazon and continues to train the next generation of marketers and analysts as associate professor of marketing at Drexel University's LeBeau College of Business. Welcome to the show, Ellie Feit.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yes, as well am I, because this is an area that I've certainly spent a lot of time researching and working on with clients over the past several years. And so I love to talk to people about this topic, and I'd love to get your ideas and your feedback. I know you certainly have a lot of experience and some thoughts around testing specifically. So super excited for this conversation. But before we kind of dive into the fun topic of testing, I want to understand a little bit about you and how you got to where you're at right now.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of grew up. My first real grown up job was at General Motors doing market research for product design. Why that? Well, mostly because I love cars. My husband and I moved to Detroit right after we got married, and he was working at Ford, and I was working at GM. And product design decisions are actually one of the biggest investments that car companies make. Developing a new car is about a $500 million exercise. And so getting the features of that car right is important. And I worked on conjoint analysis, which is this survey technique that we use to understand how customers trade off features like fuel economy against roominess, sportiness, other features of the car. Um, so what really motivates me is working on problems that are sort of fundamental problems for a company. Um, so after I ended up getting a PhD and I landed a job running at the Wharton Customer Analytics Initiative here in Philadelphia. Um, and in that job, I talked to a lot of companies about marketing analytics cast very broadly, like all different, inventory planning and forecasting and, basically anything that could be called marketing analytics. And during the time I was working there, I realized that ad measurement and experiments for incrementality, that's what I would call them, holdout experiments, are also kind of fundamental to marketing decisions, right? If you think about a CMO's job and what they control, they might influence the product design, but they definitely control this huge budget for advertising. And so if we can understand which advertisements are working, which aren't, and kind of reallocate that spend, that ends up being kind of a fundamental business decision. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching classes and writing papers about that that topic area.
That's amazing, and that's I feel to me it feels like the question that marketers have been trying to answer forever since there has been marketing is. And I hate to even use this quote because it's at this point it feels so cliche, but John Wanamaker, half of my marketing budget is wasted. I just don't know which half, right? And that's it continues today. Like we haven't solved that necessarily. I think we've made some progress for sure, but that's the thing that I've been focused on for a long time, and I know a lot of others have been really working on how do we solve that problem. Um,
If you go to England, they attribute that quote to Lord Leverhulme.
no way.
They do, which is
Interesting.
horrible. As a Philadelphian, like we want to honor John Wanamaker, who had a store in Philadelphia
Right.
that whose building still
Ah,
exists
that's
right
interesting.
there on Market Street. But yeah, other people say that it was someone else who said that. But of course, it's true, right? We don't know which ads work, and if we could make those decisions even just a little bit more efficiently, there's just a ton of opportunity there.
Yeah.
It's funny, a lot of academics tend to pick very nichey problems to work on. That's sort of the pleasure of the ivory tower is you get to work on whatever you want. But I tend to pick problems that are just sort of fundamental to the company.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways you can go with this question of attribution. A lot of different directions you can take it. And one way that you took it was tackling this whole experimentation framework for marketers with the test and enroll framework. I think I call it a framework. I don't know if that's appropriate. Do you call it? So is it really a framework or is it something else there? Sorry,
I think it's a
getting
framework for how you could call it a framework. It's
okay.
a framework for how you should think um, about planning marketing experiments. So I
Okay.
think framework is fair. Um, we'll get into it in a bit, but the details of exactly how I set up the problem are very specific to one kind of test. But we could talk about how you could modify it for other types of tests. So in that sense, yeah, I think a framework is a good
Okay.
term.
Yeah, maybe a little bit too pedantic, but sometimes language matters. So let's dive into it and talk about what is test and roll. Um, maybe give the 30-second overview of what this is.
So I guess I'll start with the story of how this idea came to me. So when I was at Wharton, I had a little side gig teaching a class called Experiments for Business Decisions. So the idea was to have a class that was just about how to run experiments, and so I was, showing them. This was pre-Optimizely. We were looking at like Adobe Test and Learn, which wasn't even called Adobe at the time, and um, anyway, this was kind of a whole semester long class that ended with a project where you had to run an experiment for a business decision and then analyze it and report the results. And I had this student, MBA student, very bright, and he was working with a well funded startup. And he computed the required textbook sample sizes to run the experiment that he wanted to run for his project. And the sample size was way bigger than he could plausibly get. Like maybe 100x what he could plausibly get given that this was a startup. Like, and we weren't talking like tiny, but he was going to run the test with maybe 200 customers, not 2,000 or 20,000.
Mhm.
And he came to me and he said, okay, I used that sample size formula you told me, and it says I need 10,000 and I'll just never get that. So should I just like not run the test? And I thought, well, obviously, having some data is better than no data. It's just not as much data as you would like to have. But if I have the choice between a little bit of maybe not quite enough data and no data, it's just like intuitively obvious that it would be better to have a little bit of data. Yet we see blog posts that are like, stop, don't run the test. You don't have enough. And I just thought, that is nutso. Who came
Right.
up with that idea? Have you had that experience of just like this is impossible. What should we do now?
It's similar, not quite that much, but I used to have account managers who were fixated on statistical significance, and we need to make sure that this test it reaches statistical significance, and it's like that word that just got stuck in their head that we need to make sure we have a big enough sample size, and we got to get that stat sig, the phrase that just
Yeah.
became so grating on me, but.
You wonder what kind of stats professors these people had that beat it into them, right?
Exactly.
Like, oh, I have to have that thing, but I don't know why. So
Yeah.
I
Well,
started to
and
think
like,
about what is
yeah.
that stats. I started to
Mhm.
think like, what is that stat sig thing? Why are we following this protocol? And so I started to read quite a lot about deeply, like back to Fisher and Neyman and the people who invented this stuff. And it's called the hypothesis testing framework. That's like kind of the official name is the null hypothesis significance test. And when that was invented, they were really worried about a certain kind of mistake. They gave it a name, false positive or type 1 error. And that mistake, it's like they couch it in jargon so you don't really understand it. But suppose you were doing a website A B test or an email A B test, and you had you made the mistake of saying that A is better than B when really A and B perform the same.
Right. Because the null hypothesis is There's no difference between A and B. They are the same. And what we're
Right.
trying to do is disprove that. We're saying this is another thing that I always had a hard time explaining or getting through to, the non-statistician. Not to take anything away from them. They're great account managers, but they're not spending every day in statistics land. So
Yeah,
getting,
totally. But
yeah,
there's a problem in statistics land. Let me get to it.
yes,
So, so the statisticians were really worried about making this mistake of saying A is different than B when really A and B are the same. And they were thinking about this in the context of science where it kind of makes sense. Like if I want to say that like this drug is better than not having the drug, then I do want to be very conservative about saying that A is better than B when potentially are the same. But if we think about the website test, what's going to happen? If I declare A is better than B when truly A and B are the same, I have not affected my profit whatsoever. I've deployed A, but it's the same as B. So
right,
it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of work going into the stat sig, that nomenclature, to protect against a kind of mistake that literally doesn't matter to us as digital marketers. Now, if A and B were like two designs of a physical store where there's a whole lot of money involved in deploying A, then we have to rethink things. But in the digital setting, the deployment is free. Like I just push a button and now it's A instead of B. And so I can kind of tolerate a lot of mistakes, even if actually B is a little better, but not very much better, and I deploy A, that's not a big deal, right? It's like
exactly.
not a very profit changing mistake. And so the statisticians didn't have profit in mind. Um, so what I did was me and a co-author of mine at Wharton, Ron Berman, we sat down and we wrote out what you should do if you're trying to maximize profit. And the first thing is going to be kind of like an intuitive revelation. If you have any amount of data and that's only the data that you have, you should pick the one with the higher average, full stop. It doesn't matter if it's stat sig or not. Like if that's the data you've got, the best evidence you have is that the one with the higher average is the better one. It might not be
Yes,
true, but you might as well go with that one. That's going to kind of maximize your profit. So that's part one. And then part two is we actually figured out, okay, what would be the optimal sample size for a test if you were trying to maximize your profit? And it turns out you can do this with calculus. Like you can do it all, like no computation, like just all on paper. Um, so sort of Ron worked it all out. And then like I took the derivative and set it equal to zero, like you learned in high school. And that was the sample size formula I solved for N. And there's our sample size formula. And then we started playing with that formula and we realized it gives you sample sizes that are like 10x smaller than what the other formula does. Because when you're thinking about profit, what's really important is that you catch the big differences and you deploy the right one when the difference is big. You really don't want to deploy A when B is a lot better.
right,
But that's going to be easy to see. If B is a lot better, you're going to see it with a small n.
exactly. And
And so,
it's
yeah,
almost like you're
anyway.
teaching marketers too that, and I like the way that this sort of dovetails with another idea that I see floating around every once in a while on LinkedIn and Twitter and everywhere, which is stop testing the small stuff. That's if it's not going to make a big difference, unless you're a huge multinational conglomerate where a 0.5% change means significant money. Test the big things, test the things that have a higher likelihood of having a larger effect, because like to your point, it's going to be much more observable with a smaller sample size, and it's going to be much easier to see that. One quote
Yeah,
I like.
especially if you're a little advertiser, test the big stuff. Test
Yes.
there is one exception to this. When say you're working with a small startup and the two founders are in total disagreement about something that the marketing analyst thinks is probably dumb, then it's worth testing it just to get them to stop thinking about
True.
it. That's a way they're wasting their time. And you can
Yeah.
sometimes shut the door on dumb conversations by saying, look, you're both right. They're the same.
Exactly. Yeah, then it's testing for political purposes.
I think testing for political purposes is a very important part of the marketing analyst practice. Like, I don't think we're not like true scientists out there. Your goal as a marketing analyst is to help the organization make better decisions, full stop. And if doing things for political reasons helps the organization move forward, go for it. Like, don't feel like that's not, in your lane as a marketing analyst. It's totally in your lane.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Um, so in terms of, so we are just talking about like taking big swings, look, going for the big changes.
Yeah.
Uh, is there a sort of a rule of thumb around how big is big? Should we like be making really like, it's hard to even articulate
Hmm.
like how do we know what is big? How do we, is it more of a, well, I think if I turn off this marketing completely, then that's big, right? Or is it if I shut off marketing 50%, to, take the budget down 50%, is that big enough? Or how do we think about how big to go,
How
or
big
what
is
does that
big
look
enough
like?
to test? Um, so this is not a question that's in the paper. So I don't have like a ready answer for you that how big is big enough to test. I think you should think about how big of an effect it has on the company. So when I was like coming up at GM, um, in the marketing research group, and we were doing some research to inform a decision, the first thing we had to do was like sketch out how much money was on the table. Like, if we make that decision better, how big a deal is it for the company? And we would have to actually like sketch out a back of the envelope calculation. And that would be the first slide in the deck of any time we reported results on that project or talked to anyone about that project. That would be the first thing there. And that was like kind of how projects got prioritized. And sometimes even the analysts would see it themselves. They'd have some passion project that they're really interested in. And then they do the back of the envelope calculation and realize, like, even when I'm trying, I can't make this important. So they back off of that project. So I think that's a
Yeah.
good rule of thumb.
Yeah, and I think of
What do
this.
you do?
Well, yeah, I was just kind of thinking how to apply that in some sort of real world scenarios where, let's say, a marketing team is wanting to test out a new channel, and they say, okay, we're gonna test out CTV ads, connected TV ads, and
Hmm.
this was a question we got a lot, which is, how big of a budget do we need to devote to this? And this is where, doing this kind of back of the napkin math could help out. And you can say, well, if we have $200,000 to spend here, the company that we're spending it with tells us this is approximately how many impressions that will get. We think, based on our domain knowledge and expertise, that we should see about this much of an effect, and it can kind of back into it. There's a lot of assumptions that have to be
And
made, and a
then
lot
say,
of,
like, oh, this is going to be well within the noise and we'll never be able to see it.
right. Or do you
Yeah.
say, well, no, if you want to really test this out, you need to make a big bet, put in $500,000, because you're definitely going to see what's happening at that level, and then we'll be
Hmm.
able to quantify it. But then there's, you have to tell a client to double their what they thought they were going to invest, double it, or at least give
Yeah,
some
yeah, and that's
recommendations.
not always easy. And if you're a third party analyst, that's easier to do than if you're the person selling the ads. It's harder, it's even more to say, well, in order to figure out if these ads work, you need to give me, $3 million, and then I'll tell you if your ads work. A lot of clients are a little leery of that when the person talking to them is the person selling the $3 million worth of ads.
Yeah. And there was the other way about getting to it, which was you test in a smaller geography than
Mm,
what would end up being rolled out. So if you have $200,000 that, if the test is successful, will be rolled out nationally, well, let's take that 200,000 and test it in a small geography. And then when we
right.
show the big effect, how big of an effect it has, you go to the client and say, well, here's how big of an effect it had when you spent 200,000 in half the country. So if you want that same effect in the whole country, you just got to double your spend.
Yeah,
But
this is where I'm going
yeah.
to start to be frustrated that this is an audio podcast. But do you talk to your clients about the S-shaped curve,
Yeah. So yeah,
the saturation
yeah.
curve? And so, yeah, if you believe that sales increase according to an S-shaped curve, it's going to be flat and then steep and then flat again. And so, if you're playing in the very high end, like we just spend a lot and we don't care range,
Mhm.
or we're not spending enough, either way, if you do a test, you're not going to see a difference because you're kind of in the flat part of the curve.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're structuring the test to be sort of, quite like a multivariate test where you're testing different levels of spend. But then that's,
Yeah,
you're
I
getting,
just saw
yeah.
a paper that actually proposes doing exactly that. So instead of running your standard incrementality
Mhm.
test, where you have um, this is my best shot at setting the campaign parameters and this is it turned off, why
Yeah.
not test, a couple points in between? And that has a huge advantage because then you can start to trace out that S-shaped response
Exactly.
curve and figure out where is the sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. I was just talking with someone from a company that does exactly that. That's a big part of what they provide from a testing framework is sort of testing across multiple spin levels to really get that level of dimensioning curves, that S curve, to really start to fill that out and get a better sense of that, which
I
is, yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, Jim. I just want to cut in to say that little noise you just heard was Jim tracing out with his hands. So for the last like 2 minutes here, Jim and I are like drawing pictures in the air with our hands. You just have to imagine that in your mind's eye.
exactly. I always, yeah, gotta
Um,
gotta think of the audio audience.
So, getting back to the test and roll framework, in that setting, so we don't give you advice in the framework for how big of how big of a change to make. Don't test
Mhm.
small A's and B's. But what we do ask you to do is to sort of explain the range of differences that you might expect between A and B. So you actually draw a probability density for that, which is a little complicated. It's maybe the hard part of it. But if you just tell me, like, I think the difference between A and B could be as big as this, or it could be zero, I can translate that into the probability. If you just say, this is the biggest difference between A and B that I could imagine happening, like it could be a 30% lift, but it can't possibly be more than that. Then we take that and that goes into our sample size formula. And so it does this cool thing that if you say, this is going to be a big lift. I think this is going to be a 2x kind of thing. It'll say run a small test because you'll be able to see that very quickly. But if you say, I think this is going to be a little thing, like it's only going to be 10 to 20%, it'll run a bigger test. It'll tell you, you need to run a bigger test for that.
Nice.
The other little thing that it has is you have to say what is your total population size that you could ever deploy on, and it will say it kind of figures out the sample size as a fraction of that. So it won't do this thing that the student at Wharton ran into with the other formula, which is the sample size is bigger than he could plausibly get, because it actually takes as input what's the plausibly largest size you can get,
Hmm.
and then it makes a trade-off. It's actually computing the cost of, there's an opportunity cost to the test, right? Because you're doing, by definition, one of those things is not better. And so you're losing some money by not giving the better thing. Of course, you don't know which one is the better thing, which is why you need the test, but the test has a cost. And then when you deploy, there's a risk that you deploy the wrong one and you make a mistake. And so what the test and roll framework does is looks at the trade-off between those two costs and tries to find out the test size that maximizes the total amount you earn, or as statisticians always think the other way. So they say the total loss. So the total loss relative to an omniscient person telling you what to do. Um, and so it actually does that. Maybe you've heard this phrase, the explore, exploit trade
Oh
off.
yeah.
So during the test, you're exploring, and then during the deploy stage, you're exploiting. And it makes a calculated risk that you will deploy the wrong one against the cost of learning more.
Okay.
If I increase the test size, my risk of deploying the wrong one goes down, but the cost of the test gets bigger. And so it makes that explicitly, but it doesn't account for media costs. So that's not kind of really baked into it in advance. So if we were thinking about incrementality tests, there's some like tweaks. This is the kind of tweaks around the edges that we would have to do to the framework to make it fit different kinds of problems.
Gotcha. And eh, and if a marketer wants to play around with this, I think you have a website that has like a calculator that they can explore and see how it works.
Yeah, it's a little like Web 2.0 clunky little calculator, but yes, you can play with it. We have a version of it where you can even, if you've run tests in the past and you think those are representative of the kind of tests that you've run, you can upload your data and then it will tell you what's the optimal size for the next tests that you run.
Awesome. And we'll
Um,
we'll include links in the show notes to
yeah, I
all
think
of
it's
these
just
resources.
testenroll.com. So I
Oh,
keep
perfect.
talking over you, Jim.
Oh, no,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. That's okay. Yeah, yeah, testenroll.com, and yeah, links in the show notes, as they say. Um,
Good.
yeah, I love we could keep talking about this, probably for the next hour, but a few more topics that we wanna kind of, talk about because I think people will have some questions about, which is along the lines of testing. Um, if we are not setting up and designing our own tests outside of platforms like Meta and Google, um, you know, Meta and Google specifically are a couple of platforms that offer in-platform testing, where you can work with their with your account manager, and they can actually get you set up with a test within Facebook or within Google search. Um, what are your thoughts about in-platform testing versus sort of this kind of outside of the platform testing? Are there sort of pros and cons to each, or one you would prefer over the other? Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly there's the do you trust the platform to execute the test? So that's always something you have to think about it. But the platforms are really in a much better position to conduct the test. So, in the end, to run a good test, you need randomization. And the best you can do from outside is like geo level randomization. And if they don't provide a tool, that ends up being like super clunky to do. It's like just a lot of detailed work that you're going to mess up. Like even had students do it. Even like 10 years ago, I had Wharton students who would run geo experiments on Facebook, um, where they'd run a creative in a different city on each day according to an experimental design called a Latin square. It was kind of cute, but they would spend hours setting up all the campaigns to do that manually, um, which is just a hassle. And they invariably would screw one cell up, and then they're like
yeah,
kind of trying to report the results at the weird cell. And
and
it's
doing
just
this,
harder.
yeah, and doing this with clients where you're working with the client and the client's vendor who's running their ads, like anytime where you have to
Oh,
coordinate the turning off or on of different ads based on geolocation, and it's just you're adding so many more areas of ways that it can get screwed up.
the other thing that the platforms can do that is very hard to do from the outside is run user level randomized experiments.
Exactly.
So the platforms can actually come up with a way where we're going to basically take a group of users and hold them out from the campaign entirely so that we have that clean control group. And so in media, when you do that, you run into this problem of exactly when the randomization happens. So this is something, if you're talking to a platform about their testing setup, you should ask them, when in the process does the randomization happen? So if they randomize based their whole user database, which is what most of the platforms do, then they have this group of people that are supposed to be withheld from the ads, but those people might never show up to the platforms. They might never use Facebook, or they never use Amazon, or whoever's running the experiment. And so those users don't get exposed. You also have people in the treatment group who don't get exposed. And people often make the mistake of comparing the users in the treatment group who actually saw the ads to everyone in the control group. But that's not a fair fight. Those not apples to apples, because it turns out like the people who use the internet more, they also buy more stuff, and so they're more likely to show up at the platform. And so you're comparing the kind of heavier users in the treatment group to the sort of heavier users plus the grandmas in the control group, the grandmas that don't buy anything online and don't use the platform very much. And so you end up with this kind of unfair test. So there's two ways around that. One is to just keep track of people who are in the control group who could have seen the ad. So that's called ghost ads. So you run the ad auction, pretending that that user is eligible, and then at the last minute you yank the ad and show something else.
Okay.
And that's like, you could never do that from the outside. You could never randomize at the user level and then make a record of the users in the control group who would have seen the ad without the assistance of the platform.
Right. And this is the whole idea around showing the control group who is not supposed to see your ad, that you show them a PSA, like a public service announcement, or some unrelated
Oh yeah,
ad
yeah.
that's
I,
not your actual advertisement for your company, right?
I skipped a step there. So if you use a PSA, then you, in theory, you have the people who should have been exposed to your ad because you get the, so whatever, the clickstream data on the users that were in the PSA group because you paid for it.
Right.
So you can do that from the outside. It's still not clean because that PSA is going to get sub-targeted by the app platform in a different way than your ad.
Yeah.
So you're going to get, like, if they're kittens, you're going to get all the kitten love in the PSA. I mean, so
Mhm.
say the PSA is for the SPCA, then you're going to get all the kitten lovers seeing that
Yeah.
ad, and your ad may not go to kitten lovers. So you're still not
Interesting.
getting like a perfectly clean comparo.
And
Whereas the platform can execute a cleaner comparison group because they can essentially just like run a fake auction on your behalf, see if you
okay.
would have won the slot, and then mark that. This is what they call ghost ads. Then you mark that user as having seen a ghost of your
Gotcha.
ad, and then you give them the next ad in line, so you still get to sell the slot and nobody had to pay for it. So
Okay.
the platforms should be able to execute these ads without charging you any extra for the media, because they're going to sell the ones they don't sell to you, they sell it to someone else, so
Yeah.
they're not losing anything revenue wise.
Interesting. And the idea, I know you said the thing that sometimes people do wrong is they compare everyone who saw your ad to the entire group of the control group, which could
Yes,
be a significant portion of people who never had the opportunity to see your ad. Doesn't does
exactly.
the randomization of users, doesn't the magic of randomization make it such that the proportion of people in each group who had the opportunity to see your ad is roughly the same, or am I missing, what am I missing with that?
So if there's two, if you run this experiment and you don't do the ghost ads thing, so you don't know who in the control group had the opportunity, what you can do is you can compare everyone in the treatment group, even the people who didn't see the ad, to everyone in the control group.
Mhm.
But you're going to get a low estimate of the, what you're estimating is really then the effective ads on all people, even people who don't see ads,
Yes.
which is a weird number to even, it's like, I've never even tried to present that to business decision makers because
Yeah.
it's too hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, and in essence, you're
Um,
back to finding, you're back to limiting the size of the effect that you're able to see, which means then you need even a bigger sample, and it's back to that whole issue.
Yes,
Yeah.
this world gets extremely it's a labyrinth to try to figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why the platforms should offer this, because they potentially can afford to have one group of people invent a clean system for doing this and then provide that as a service to all advertisers. That's like should be more efficient than having all the advertisers from the outside trying to figure out how to do ad measurement. But of course, the platforms themselves are not totally sure that they want to do this or not do this, right? Platforms are big companies. Big companies are a mess of people making weird, messy decisions together.
And even if they are
So
trying to do it for the right reasons, there's always going to be the people who are skeptic and say, "Oh, sure, Google search, you're going to let me test my ads, and let me guess, you're going to tell me the ads were phenomenal and I should spend more money with ads," right?
exactly, yes. But there's another reason the platforms should be doing it that I kind of wanted to highlight. They sell a product. Can you imagine selling a product and you have absolutely no idea how much value it provides to your customers? You can't do basic marketing 101 like value based pricing if you don't know the value of it.
Exactly.
And so I really think even if the platforms don't offer it as a service, they should at least be setting up the systems to do this measurement themselves so that they can say, like, we think that we're providing this much value to, and this could be different by industry. So like Google could say, oh, we're providing this much value to airlines and we're providing less value to CPG firms, maybe. And so now we should maybe think about pricing models that account for that. And also, we should prioritize the impressions to the airlines because they're getting more, it's generating more value.
It's so interesting because there's sort of this competing incentives, right? If I'm Google or if I'm Meta, I would think that from the outside looking in, they would be incentivized to have this information be obscured, to be opaque, because if there's knowledge asymmetry and the people buying the ads don't know the true value, then it seems like the platforms would have more power in that scenario.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you entirely. But I think the platforms should, at the very least, know for themselves
Yeah, yeah,
because they don't have a very good ability to predict when an advertiser is going to walk because they don't. It's like everybody's just arguing about whether these ads provided value and nobody actually knows. So the platform is in a position to know, which would actually give them even more
yeah.
information asymmetry and power in the relationship. So I think they should be building these systems.
I
Um,
Yeah, and that's the other side of it, which I think they are. I would I'd like to think that they're doing it for the right reasons. I think, a lot of the advancements that I've been seeing lately around, both the in-platform testing for Meta and for Google, which haven't haven't been there forever, right? Those are somewhat new features, but also an area that I'm even more focused on, which is in the marketing mix modeling area. You have Meta, probably the most notable one, putting out an open source R package called Robin, which is
mhm,
open source semi autonomous modeling, marketing mix modeling. Um, and then you also have Google. They put out their sort of unofficial package called Lightweight MMM, which is a Bayesian model. There's a lot of other examples out there. PyMC Marketing has one out there. There's people are even using Uber's Orbit package or library to help
uh-huh.
with MMM. But mostly, with what we see with what Meta has been doing the last few years, trying to really develop MMM with Robin and what Google has been putting out there, it seems like at least some portions of those companies are being incentivized to make measurement easier for their customers. And I'd like to think that that's a good thing, and they're doing it for altruistic purposes, and because they believe their product does have value. But what do you think of this area with marketing mix modeling? I know it's not something that you focused on as much, but how do you see it from your seat?
I think it's super exciting. Like I was actually looking at Robin's documentation and the Bayesian, the lightweight, Google's lightweight MMM just before this call. And here's the one thing: as a modeler, it's really hard to like figure out about what all these things are doing under the hood. They're like very slick software packages that make it really easy to do something that you have no idea what it is. So, like from your perspective, are they all good, or do you have to like pick and choose, or have we gotten to an equilibrium where everybody's offering like a pretty good modeling product, or are we not
Yeah,
quite there
that's
yet?
that's a great question. Something that I'm kind of currently trying to research myself. Basically, trying to compare several models on the same data set and just seeing how they perform. And what's sort of unknown to me too is okay, if you have a sample data set and you run them on all three and you get the best performance from each model, one is going to perform better than the others. But is it because of that data set, or is it going to apply to all data sets? Like each data set might have its own peculiarities that mean, oh well, this data set had a lot more TV spend, and so maybe lightweight does better with modeling TV spend than it does with more performance based marketing, or,
Hmm.
or something like that, right? So it's to me, I'm currently, I guess, less interested in which one is best. and more interested in just getting customers to use one of them, any of them, like to even kind of start down that path of let's get away from last touch attribution or multi-channel attribution or data-driven attribution that you're used to looking at in Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics or whatever analytics platform you're looking at. And let's at least try to use something that's a little bit better at answering one of the more important questions that you're asking, which is how is this channel performing? How much money should I put into this channel versus this other channel? What's the incremental return on investment versus the ROI that is given from some attribution tool like Google Analytics or whatever it might be that is clearly not right.
Yeah, I'm not as I hear you. I hear you. I do like I did we started out talking about some data must be better than no data. But that was specific to randomized experiments. So in a
Mhm.
randomized experiment, you can hardly get it wrong. That's why we teach it to 8th graders in their science fair projects. If you ran 1, 2, 3, repeat with me, randomization will set
Yeah,
you free.
love it.
And when we get to MMM world, we are constrained by the data is imperfect, and these models have kind of a lot of structure built into them to try to get information out of this small amount of data. And so there's a lot of analyst degrees of freedom to sort of change the model. I'll tell you a quick story. The only commercial MMM I ever built, I was like kind of a third party consultant to a market research firm. And there was an analyst who'd just gotten her master's degree in econometrics, and she was running the models. I just sort of told her what to do, and then she did it. And then she called me and she said, Ellie, you said that like this assumption could be either this way or that way. So I tried it both ways, and I can flip the signs on whether advertising works or doesn't work. I was like, oh, that's like a scary situation to be in. So the reason I'm so obsessed with like what is the structure in these models is um, it does matter for the answer you get. With randomization, you'll kind of the bigger your data set, the closer you'll get to the truth. But with modeling, if you have the analyst imposing assumptions on the data and those assumptions are wrong, you could go completely off course. So I'm a little worried about this. So one of my next
Mm,
research projects, the reason I'm looking at all these packages is I would like to go back to the marketing literature and look at experiments and say, what do we really know about these things empirically? So, for instance, these models impose these decay functions for how fast the advertising, basically how long advertising lasts. And we could go back to experiments and analyze them and see if they follow the shapes that we're using in the models so that at least we have a little bit more foundation for those strong assumptions that go into the models.
yeah, there is a fair bit of is the cart leading the horse and how we build models, right? Like we have this assumption about how things work, and so we try to build a model that fits those assumptions, right? We think, oh well, if someone sees our TV ads this week, there's a likelihood that they might buy next week or even next month, and so there's got to be some sort of decay function in there to make sure that the spend of TV this week kind of decays over time. So we have to model that out and write our fancy mathematical equation to account for that. But again,
I'm
we're
going to use this Weibull thing that I found
yes.
a Wikipedia page for. Seems to be the right shape roughly. What
Exactly.
I'd like
Yeah.
to do is compare that Weibull to data sets where we could actually observe that decay, like in a randomized experiment where we can look at the difference between the control and the treatment
Yeah.
over time and say, yeah, you should use the Weibull, or no, you shouldn't. Or yes, you should use the Weibull for TV, but you should not use it for search because search is different.
Right.
Those are the kinds of questions I think that's where academia, that's a sweet spot for an academic to contribute like kind of foundational knowledge that the rest of the industry can build on.
Exactly. And exactly the kind of research that you can do and the test and experimentation that you can do that, a business isn't going to do that, right? They're not going to necessarily want to, with such, sort of pinpoint accuracy, understand exactly what is the decay rate of this channel. They need to make bigger decisions. How, where am I going to put my budget in this channel or that? And, you know, yeah.
So I'll just put it out there. If you know or any of your listeners have clean RCTs that they want to donate to this scientific endeavor, they should email me. I would
Yes,
be really excited. Like if we had some clean RCTs, then the more I have, the more I can start to say like, these are the general things you should be doing in your models, and these are things you probably shouldn't be doing.
that would be fantastic. Well, definitely, any listeners that have some nice, clean test results or tests that you've run and are willing to donate that, let's please get in touch. Um,
Just like give your body to science, give your data to
yes,
science.
I love it. Give your data to science. Um, so as we kind of wrap up, and this is maybe a good segue, for people who want to get in touch with you, if they have data that they want to donate, if they have questions and they want to reach out to you, are you active on LinkedIn or Twitter, or how should they?
I am active in both of those places. We'll see how long Twitter lasts. That's where I am most days.
Threads
But
or
if you,
Mastodon?
yeah, I got those too, but
Nice.
I'm not sure where I'll be hanging out.
Okay,
So LinkedIn is probably the safest bet for now. I think Microsoft is in it for the long haul.
definitely.
Um, but you can also just email me, eliefeit.com, ELEAFEIT. And yeah, I'm happy to talk to marketers. I have a rule that I'll talk to anyone for half an hour. So
Awesome. Very generous. All right.
happy to.
And are there any questions that I didn't ask that, or any last parting thoughts that you want to get out there?
Um, just that causal inference is hard. So if you want to know if your action is affecting an outcome, the only way really to do it is to randomize. Everything else, you have to be super careful.
Absolutely. We need T-shirts that say "Randomization will set you free."
We do. We totally need that.
Okay.
I'm going to act on that, Jim.
Okay. Well, whichever one of us acts on it first. If I get them printed first, I'll send you one, and we'll get those
Vice
out there. Yeah.
versa. Right back at you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ellie, for spending so much time with us, and we'll talk to you next week. Actually, I don't know why I said that. I still don't have my catchphrase for the ending of the show, so
I am also looking for a catchphrase for the ending of my class. So when you come up with one,
all right. I could steal from Analytics Power Hour, and I could say, and remember, just keep analyzing. But Michael Helbling might take issue with that one, so I have to come up with my own. But we'll get to it one of these days. But in the meantime, keep randomizing.